Jeff Mackler. Jeff is the National Secretary of Socialist Action, author of Obama's National Security State, the meaning of the Edward Snowden revelations, here it is. He's also the director of the mobilization to free Mumia Abu-Jamal in Northern California. He's also author of the CIA crack in America. And Jeff is involved in a million different struggles and is a veteran activist like Ralph here in the revolutionary movement.
When I began thinking about this pamphlet, no one knew about Edward Snowden, including myself. And I was outraged in listening to a May 23rd speech by the President of the United States explaining that we in America do not want to be the nation of perpetual war since 9/11. We do not want a president who has unlimited power to kill people. We have to be more moderate and demonstrate that we are a nation of freedom. Even I, the president, said Obama, need restraints. I need oversight before I sign off on a kill list. But otherwise, he reaffirmed that the United States was the most democratic nation on earth. And 1 week later, Edward Snowden blew the whistle and demonstrated, and I want to say demonstrated, that the United States spies on everyone, everywhere, all the time, through every media, and has been doing so for decades, except Snowden proved it. The beauty of Snowden and Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange is they use the documents of the United States themselves. No one could refute the federal documents. So the first reaction of the United States was to deny it when the first reports of Snowden spying came out. We don't really do that. We don't even look at those emails. We dump it into a special program for future use. And then Snowden revealed that they have direct access to everyone. And then they said, well, we just use internet and we have selective words that we put in. And it turned out that the selective words went into hundreds of thousands of millions of people. Then he said it's just a limited number of spying. And then Snowden pointed out that it was this was in the beginning, 3 billion communications a day they spied on. Then he said it's just Americans, and then it was the world. Then it was heads of state. And what were they spying for? They said terrorism. This was done in the name of the protection of the national security interests of the United States to prevent, as Mike says, the new war on terrorism. But it turned out that they were doing industrial spying. It turned out that they were spying on the technologies of competitive corporations in other countries. They were spying on the military institutions of other countries. They spied on the head of the United Nations and stole his crypt notes his talking points before he went in to see the president. They spied on Angela Merkel and the head of Brazil and everyone else in the world. Obama said initially, why, yes, we spy, all nations do, there's no problem with it, and so on, just a normal thing. But we never would spy like stealing the secrets of Apple Computer. Well, turns out they're spying on the leading corporations in the world. Someone once asked, well, what are we going to do when the Cold War is over and the Russians are no longer the communist menace? And a smart person said, well, we'll just use the CIA for industrial spying. That means the United States is in competition, U.S. corporations, with a rebuilt world of Japan and China and Europe and so on, and we cannot compete competitively on world markets, so one of the ways you increase your competitive edge is to steal the other guy's technology. Not to mention lower the wages of working people, transfer their jobs abroad, attack working people everywhere, deny their civil liberties and democratic rights. All of this was done in the name of national security. And I, being a meticulous mind, began to file. Every day I would write down so I didn't get the facts wrong. Every new thing that Julian Assange and that Chelsea Manning and especially Edward Snowden did. So I would get the story straight. But eventually there was nothing left to write down, because the truth was that they spied on everyone all the time, on everything without exception, including each other in the United States. So they had to justify this. First they denied it, and then they said, okay, we do spy on everyone, everywhere, all the time, on everything, for every reason. But so do they. And the British and the French, who were part of it, said, it's true, we spy too, but not as much as you. And they responded that we don't come near what you do. Why, you spy more than everyone. We have a Five Eyes program. New Zealand, Canada, Australia, England, and the United States all collaborate. They promise that they will not spy on each other as long as they collaborate to collectively spy on everyone else. And Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, complained, how dare you exclude us? She was spied on herself. I want to be the sixth eye, so I can spy on the rest of the world. Yes, they were spying on us because they are afraid. They know that the gap between the anger and frustration of the world's people today and the relative passivity in the United States will eventually be closed. People despise the austerity that is imposed on them. The youth despise the unemployment. The workers despise the smashing of the unions, the loss of their pensions. But they don't see a way out at this point. That little tiny election in Seattle, raise your hand if you heard about it, that said to people what the polls showed. And we socialists don't always look at the polls, which said that 48% of all young people under 30 believe that socialism is better than capitalism. Where did these young people get this idea? Well, they just voted a majority city council member of a group that calls itself Revolutionary Socialist. Whatever criticism you may have of that group, and everyone has their own criticisms, that was a lesson that we shouldn't forget. There was no Arab Spring, and then every country went up for grabs. Why? What was the common theme in Egypt and in Tunisia? It wasn't that Mubarak was a 30-year dictator. They knew that. It wasn't that the fundamentalists ran Tunisia. It was that in every one of these countries, including Syria and Libya, the capitalist governments, as part of the world crisis of capitalism, had to impose neoliberal assaults on their working people and attack their standard of living, privatize their industry, cut their social services, and increase repression in every nation. In Brazil, they raised the train fare, or the bus fare, 6 cents, and hundreds of thousands of people went into the street. In Turkey, they said they were going to take a public park and turn it into a shopping mall. And hundreds of thousands of people went into the street. In Tunisia, a young, desperate man who had his vegetable stand closed down brought hundreds of thousands of people in the street that drove a dictator from power. So the anger is there. The question is, can that anger be channeled in the right direction? In truth, Snowden revealed what we on the left knew a long time ago. Debbie and Mike and Joe and I were once part of a party that sued the government for spying on us in the early 1970s or 1960s. Under the Freedom of Information Act, we were the first party to get this was Socialist Workers' Party, to get the United States government to admit that they were spying on us. So we said, how many spies? And they said, well, just 1,100. That was more than our membership. 1,100 spies in the course of 45 years. And when we went through a 10-year battle, and finally got up to the courts, the final court, And we demanded the names of the FBI agents, and the government said we wouldn't turn them over. And the judge said to the Attorney General, you turn him over or else, and he didn't. And they ordered him to jail. So we reached a compromise, and they agreed that every act of spying was illegal, unconstitutional, and prima facie evidence for finding the government for each and every one of the 1,100 spies. And then finally, when the government said, when the Judge Grisa said to the government, after 45 years and 1,100 spies, have you ever found a member of the party to have committed an illegal act? And the government of the United States said no. 45 years? All these years, all these spies, not one illegal act, how can you justify that? They didn't even say national security. And we won that suit. It was a victory for the First Amendment. Today, the First Amendment is washed away in the name of national security. You know, I read a book this thick by the, what was his name? The former Alan Greenspan, head of the Federal Reserve. And he said, in Iran, we overthrew the Shah because the 800-pound gorilla in the room was that they were the world's leading oil reserve country. Not the Shah, the Mossadegh regime. And replaced it. They got the Shah, who had been in exile in Spain, and they made him the new head of the country. And Greenspan said the 800-pound gorilla was a national security issue for the United States. National security to organize a coup to steal the oil. What else is national security? Obama said that the building of the XL pipeline so it can move deadly fracking material is a national security issue for the United States government. Every single war we fight is a national security issue for the United States government. Every nation that we invade is done in the name of defending the national security of the United States. In the past, the national security was the communist menace, and now, as Mike said, it's the war on terror. A war which Mike correctly pointed out when, who was it that challenged it, that actress, Susan Sontag, or was it?
No. Yeah, she's not an actress, but yeah.
Yeah, and when she said, you know, does the fact that you have 1,100 military bases around the world in countries everywhere and that exploit and oppress and murder people, like 4 million in Vietnam, 1.5 million in Iraq. You used poison gas that you gave Saddam Hussein to drop on the Iranian people to bring down the revolution that took back the oil. All the slaughter that you have perpetrated, the annihilation of the Palestinian people, does that mean anything? Could that get a few people mad? Not of Afghanistan, who we invaded and have now been there for 13 years, but it was Egyptians that blew up the thing. But Egypt was our ally. We didn't make war on the Mubarak dictatorship. We defended the Mubarak dictatorship. And when he came down because millions demonstrated in Tahrir Square, the United States said to the dictatorship, just get rid of the mask of Mubarak and put someone else in there, have an election. And Morsi won the election, and they ran him out quick. And now they're supporting Sisi, the new general who just got finished slaughtering 7,000 Muslims in the first couple of weeks and arresting the entire leadership. 10 million people are members of the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't care what you think about the politics, but if you're serious about bringing working people together, you don't cheer on the slaughter of the Muslim people. So the national security interest is defined as giving the president the right to kill anyone, anywhere. Sending 3,500 troops to 35 African countries to use drones to keep people at bay and murder anyone in order to secure the resources of that country. Why else are we in Africa? Recolonizing an entire continent against the interests of the French colonial empire and the others who formerly divided up Africa. We're in the Middle East, not for any other reason other than to exploit the resources. We're in Afghanistan because it is the world's largest, has the world's largest copper reserves and the world's largest rare earth metals, which are central to the production of computers. We're there for geopolitical reasons to advance the national security interests of the United States. Now, I want to make a retraction. Not the national security interests of the United States, but the national security interests of the ruling class corporate 0.001% of the population. Now, you'd say, well, if that's true, Jeff, then why did they just fine J.P. Morgan Chase $14 billion? That's not peanuts. How many of you knew that J.P. Morgan got fined $14 billion? And they did that. You just took my punchline away when you said peanuts. Poor J.P. Morgan Chase. And so I looked up the assets of J.P. Morgan Chase, which turned out to be $4 trillion. And then I wrote out the figure 14 billion. And then I wrote out the figure 14 trillion, which I think has 12 zeros. And because I used to teach a little math, at least arithmetic anyway, but I would cross out the zeros and I came to the final figure and I divided, and they actually had to say they will fine them. They're never going to pay the fine by the time they manipulate it, but that turns out to be 1/3 of 1% of the assets of J.P. Morgan, which they won't pay. They didn't arrest anybody like J.P. Morgan because they're too big to put Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan's heirs in jail. These are the colonizers of Africa. When King Leopold killed 12 million blacks in the colonization of the Congo, he gave the mining rights to J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller. They existed on the blood and sweat of slavery in this country and abroad. So there is no issue that you can raise. We justify torture, rendition, Abu Ghraib, oil wars, all in the name of national security. Do you think we invaded Libya and bombed the nation to smithereens with NATO, the world's greatest armada, and the U.S. because we wanted to bring democracy or humanitarian mission and have 4% of the world's oil? If you look at the New York Times to see who got the oil in Iraq, it'll say Corporation A, B, and C. But if you look at who got the real rights, it's the American oil corporations. They were the ones that went into Iraq to get the oil. Tripoli was liberated by Qatari troops. How many of you knew that? Qatar is a huge country. There's about 3 monarchs in it. And they don't have an army, so they rented one. And it's a privatized army trained and organized by Blackwater and financed by the United States. And those were the troops that went in to liberate Tripoli, not the Libyan people. Whatever small core of revolutionaries were there in the beginning were wiped out, and the transitional government was the representatives of capital all over the world who collectively bombed that country. And now, if you just read the New York Times, the place is so chaotic, the militias of the Al-Qaeda just walked in to the president's residence last week and arrested the president of the country. And the NSA said to him, if you don't let him go, we'll bomb the shit out of you with a drone tomorrow. They let him go the next day. And they're at war with each other. So the New York Times reported yesterday that the United States is training 7,000 troops to send to Libya because they have there's no revolution in Libya. It was liberated by imperialism. So what I'm saying is that the Snowden revelations revealed what is the norm everywhere all the time. Do you know how many people they have working who are certified with national security clearance for the NSA? 1.3 million people. That's roughly 1 out of every 300 people. That means one of you, 35 people in this room, has to be working for the NSA, just statistically speaking. Raise your hand if you are, just to know. You say that jokingly. But when I gave the statistics to a friend of mine in Chicago last week about Rockefeller and about the fine for J.P. Morgan, this is a true story. 3 days ago I said, J.P., they fined him $14 billion. And 2 days later, my phone rang. And I'm pathologically addicted, as all revolutionaries are, to answering the phone. And I looked up and it says on it, and I promise this is the truth, J.P. Morgan Chase. And I figured this is just a commercial call. And I'm going to say, no, thank you, I already have an account. And I listened for him to make his pitch, and he said, how much is this Socialist Action newspaper? I said, yes, it is. He says, how much is a subscription to your newspaper? And I said, $20, but we have a deal, a special deal. You get 2 years for $37.
Jeff, you said $1 million.
Right. So I said to him, but I find it unusual that J.P. Morgan Chase would be calling about a subscription to our newspaper. You don't believe me I'm saying this, right? I mean, believe me, it happened. He says, oh, that must be some kind of aberration in the phone. I'm not from J.P. Morgan. And he hung up. Of course, we always get calls for membership in our Revolutionary Party from J.P. Morgan employees. He didn't take a subscription. It gave me a shot of paranoia, I have to admit. But because 2 days ago I was talking about J.P. Morgan. And all you have to do with, big money, they file a lawsuit saying you attacked J.P. Morgan, you have to spend $1 million for a lawyer. It happens. As Forrest Gump said, shit happens. I ran for Senate in 2006 as a write-in candidate. And 4 years later, the state of California passed a law, Proposition 14, that banned write-in candidates, had open primaries, and said that everybody who's a Democrat or Republican can have their party listed, but if you're not ballot certified, that is, they get 50 signatures there on the ballot, we need 500,000. So we have to list no party preference. I'm national secretary of my party. I have to write I don't have a party preference. So I filed a suit with 6 other defendants against the state of California for my democratic rights to run a write-in candidate. And a multi-billionaire, Charlie Munger, from the Republican Party, went to the judge and said, we don't believe that the state of California is going to adequately defend against Jeff Mackler in his lawsuit. We want to be a friend of the court and file our own brief. They brought in their legal team. We lost the case. Did I tell you that? And when we lost the case, Charlie Munger gave a note to the judge saying our legal fees were $243, and the judge fined us $243,000. So we went to our lawyers. Lynn Stewart is the only honest lawyer left in the country. My brother, who is a lawyer, said, I've never met an honest lawyer in my whole life, including me, his brother. But in any case, leaving aside the family humor, we went to a bunch of lawyers and they said, well, you can appeal. We're going to appeal and fight this. And she said, but if you go to the next level court, it'll cost you another $250,000 in legal fees. And we said, we're going to fight this. And they said, but if you go to the California Supreme Court, it'll cost you another that's $750,000. And then some schmuck who was part of our team said, yes, but we can appeal to the United States Supreme Court. And I could see saying, Justice Scalia, the laws of the United States require that you cannot punish people from filing a lawsuit unless it's totally frivolous. I just wanted to get on the ballot. I just wanted to have my party listed like everybody else. And Justice Scalia, I'm sure, would have abided by the Constitution of the United States. Just like all the other mass murderers, they abide by the Constitution of the United States. We live in a Truman Show world. Now, how many of you have not seen the Truman Show? Okay. We live in a Potemkin Village world. You know what that is? They create a reality that tells us that we're free. that this all started with Snowden, or it all started with 911, or it all started with the Political Rights Defense Fund. It all started when a couple of Romans spied on a guy named Jesus Christ for telling the truth. And even before then, every ruling power has been in history a minority. And in order to continue their rule, they require, in one form or another, force, either control of the courts, the government, the military, the police. So they systematically use that force when they need it. And all of the laws that we've been talking about tonight that have been abrogated, and new laws put in, by the way, every single day that Snowden was exposed the United States for violating the law, they changed the law the next day. They just got the president to say, sign this, it's legal. Sign this, it's legal. Or they got a committee, or some oversight group. Dianne Feinstein said, well, I knew all about this spying all along. Someone told me a long time ago. You know, Dianne Feinstein is the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee. It's all legal because someone told me about it. Didn't tell anybody else in the world. So we live in a world where we're told we have democratic rights and we rule. In truth, the minority capitalist class rules. They make all the laws and they unmake all the laws. They change every law they wanted. Whatever rights we ever won have been in struggle, including the right to collective bargaining, the right to free speech. We had to have an American Revolution to win that. And initially it was taken seriously. Why is all this happening now? Why all this repression? Why do they admit it? Because they fear that that contradiction, that gap between the consciousness that we live in a repressive society and the inaction, roughly speaking, is going to close. They know it's going to close. Obama claims, for example, that we brought 1 million jobs to the United States, 1 million new jobs. 600,000 of them were low-wage, service sector, non-union, part-time, no benefit jobs. 250,000 of those jobs were part-time. And the other 100,000, roughly speaking, were casual labor. They didn't bring any jobs. We lost 250,000 manufacturing union jobs last year. They are bringing back the garment industry from Bangladesh because it's more profitable than the United States. They went to Bangladesh because they could have labor for 6 cents an hour. But now they have automated machinery that can have 200 people doing what 2,000 did at low-wage, non-union North Carolina wages and tax breaks. And when you factor in the cost savings in transportation, the American giant, as this textile industry has said, it's more profitable for us to produce in the United States. That's the real meaning of the race to the bottom. And they don't do it because they're mean or greedy. They do it because they have no alternative in capitalist society, because their whole system is in crisis. The 2008 crisis was not an accident or stupidity. The ruling class found that they could not make a significant enough profit in manufacturing the basic commodities because the world competition was so intensified everywhere else that the average profit rates were declining everywhere. So instead of investing in new machinery, like General Motors is a classic example, the former world's largest corporation went bankrupt. A higher and higher percentage of the tiny profits they made were no longer invested, and yet the next round of new technology which became obsolete in 6 months, given the pace of worldwide capitalist automation. So they began to invest in the gambling casino that capitalism is today. And the whole system came crumbling down because it was based on air. It started out with real estate. How many of you ever heard from your parents that real estate, my son and daughter, is the one thing you should invest in because it never goes down? Peanuts? You're the only one that said that? Nobody else ever heard that? Real estate never goes down? Okay, admit it. You all heard it. So they gave out mortgages for nothing. and low mortgage rates. Everybody bought houses. Some people said, listen, even if we can't afford the house, we have 2 jobs. Even if we lose the damn house, we can always sell it because it'll go up 10% every year, and we won't lose anything. And the whole thing collapsed. And with it, Bernanke and, what was his name, Secretary of Treasury at the time, met with the richest capitalist representatives in the world in downtown Washington. The New York Times showed a picture of the meeting. Literally, the mahogany table they sit around. And they walked into the Congress of the United States with 3 pieces of paper, and they stopped by to see George Bush, and they said, if we don't pass this bill, TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program, if they don't pass this bill, the entire financial system is going to come crashing down. And what do you think George Bush said? Why didn't anybody tell me? The President of the United States didn't know. And Congress said $700 billion, and they sort of recessed, came back a day later, because they all read, well, the money trough is now open, so let's raise it to $850 billion, and they did it. And in the subsequent years, they have gifted the ruling class $35 trillion. They're continuing. You ever hear about the debate, the new Treasury Secretary, what is it, Janet Yellen? What's her position? Is she the Federal Reserve? She's the new Federal Reserve head. She's, I'm going to continue this, what?
Quantitative easing.
Quantitative easing. That's a simple way of saying that the government of the United States prints $89 billion a month to buy worthless mortgages from banks and insurance companies. It's all fake money. And they bail out a system to keep this sick system alive. They print money and they give it away free. That's why they had to raise the debt ceiling. They can't pay their debts, so they had to increase the debt ceiling. Since this crisis, the debt went from 10 trillion to today $17.5 trillion. We don't have, that's more than the GDP of the entire United States. And every other country is worse. In Italy, their debt is 240% of the GDP. Every country is in debt, living on credit, and their rates of profits are falling. And how do they solve that problem? By sending people to work for China at 6 cents an hour, and China's priced itself out of the world market now because they went up to $1 an hour. So people go to Bangladesh or the United States where they can have people for less. And I only mean that half facetiously. That's why the pensions are cut. That's why civil liberties are annihilated. That's why we have endless wars. Not because Obama's a bad man. I'm sure he's a nice guy and he has a nice dog. I can tell you about his dog. It's a Portuguese water dog, you know, with no hair, and it's not hypoenergetic, whatever you call it. Nice kids and so on. He just happens to be running capitalism for the ruling class of America. That's the assignment they gave. They put a black mask on the white face of a defunct system. A sick system that has to live on war like Mother Courage. Dependent on war to survive. War and the repression of people. And all of these laws are being put into place for us. And there's only one way to beat them. And they know that. That's one of the reasons why Joe mentioned they went after a socialist group. 27 people, most of them members of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. They want to say we can go after the socialists. Because they know the socialists have one thing in common, despite all our differences in it a lot. We believe that we can organize the working class for its own liberation. The whole working class. Blacks and Latinos and the oppressed and the immigrants. That's the only way you can beat a system. That's what the revolution really is. It's not going to be a minority coup, and it's not going to be an Occupy Zuccotti Park. It's going to be a deeply ingrained, massive, united, revolutionary movement that has won the allegiance of the whole working class. And then all of the repressive apparatus will disappear like it did in Egypt. When millions went into the street, the army couldn't kill everybody. And that will happen in the United States, and that's what they're preparing for. They think that they can write laws to legally make it impossible for us to protest, to pen in our protests, to restrict our parade routes, to not give us sound systems, or to turn us against each other, to divide us. Immigrants are taking our jobs. Blacks are all criminals, shoot them down. Even the prison industrial complex has become a profit-making industry. We now have 7.2 million people in prison, majority Black, Latino, and Native American, under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system, and 3.5 million in prison, and the healthiest of those are working in Fortune 500 companies that guess what the average prison wage is? 50 cents an hour. In Georgia and Texas, it's 0. Forced labor, so they don't need the immigrants. Obama deports them to the tune of 300,000 every year. And 700,000 Muslims have been detained, arrested, investigated. 99.9999% of them are innocent. They want to set the tone for repression. Pit whites against Muslims, against blacks, against immigrants, and demonize every one of them, including women, who they want to drive back into the workforce. The horror perpetrated on women on this planet, as the tour that UNAC organized for Malalai Joya evidenced in Afghanistan, where it's the worst place in the world for women to live. They are treated as subhuman, as Malalai said. But the use of women for prostitution, for forced labor, for slave labor, and in the United States, all these attacks are once again to divide down, to divide us all, and lower everyone's wages and repress us. So we're talking about Snowden revealing a truth that has long been known. A ruling class that is desperate and has no way out other than on the backs of working people everywhere. There's no nation that is free from this worldwide austerity. And that's what a revolutionary party is. Socialist Action is going to lead the American Revolution. But it won't be the Socialist Action we have now, a tiny revolutionary party. It'll be a party where every fighter will be part of a common revolutionary struggle. The best of all the fighters. What happened in the Russian Revolution? All the other parties who were serious joined the Bolshevik Party. They started as a minority party, and they made the greatest revolution in the history of the world, in one of the poorest capitalist countries. So civil liberties are under attack, but as the title of my pamphlet says, the real meaning of the Snowden affairs is that capitalism in crisis, and it fears the world's working people, and it has no solution than their subjugation and repression and exploitation. And the workers of the world have no alternative but to challenge this sick system, put it out of its misery once and for all, and set up the world's first majority society, where the workers and the oppressed rule in their own name, democratically, through their own institutions, for the benefit of humanity and not the profits of the capitalist exploiters. Thank you.